involved. And so you need to focus on those things that are important, such as the strategy and the forward thinking, the succession, and leaving the operation to management. I do believe that when the board is driving those things, that you get and you optimize board effectiveness. The other one that I think is so important is the what, and that is ensuring that you have the right skills and experiences added to the board in alignment with the strategy. The role of the board is to ensure that you're able to provide appropriate guidance to management, and your role is to ensure that you're bringing in those skills that's needed at any given time. And then the how is equally as important, which in my mind is ensuring that that you have the right attitudes and the behaviors on the board that will lead to the best decisions. Examples include being open to others' perspective and willing to listen and willing to challenge, and then being able to move forward in a constructive way for the benefit of the shareholders. And then finally, and again, Anthony talked about this as well, as we do in everything in life, we inspect what we expect, and the role of self-assessment in that process and continuous learning is so critical. So those are the 5 things that I think are so important. I think it's universal that you have to do those things if you're going to have a highly functioning or a board that is optimizing and supporting management and driving shareholder value. So those are my high level ones that I want to talk about. Robin, you gave me like 4 or 5 questions in there, and I think I tried to hit many of them during that update.
No, that was great. It was very structured and inspect what we expect. I love that. That's a good phrase.
Always.
That's great. Nigel, you have a broad wealth of experience in different companies, different countries, et cetera. So you may have, each board is unique. Each culture is unique. We probably have all experienced that, but I'd love to hear you share a little bit about your thoughts on effective boards, optimizing boards, and even any challenges you've had or stories.
So, Robin, thank you. And yes, indeed, I've been fortunate enough to be on public boards in 3 countries. You may guess 2, but the third one is Japan, where boards are very different from here. I mean, most of the controversial subjects are discussed the night before over large quantities of wine and food. And I always remember being at a Japanese board meeting where I suggested that the performance was so good, we should increase the bonus pool. And you would have considered that I'd committed some kind of violent offense because you don't bring up things like that in a Japanese board. So getting back to the effectiveness of a board, I agree very much with what Gail said, but I wrote down 3 words that really I think are important, be it a private board, a public board, and that is openness. And I think Gail touched on that. You really need to have an open mind. And I think too often directors go to board meetings and say, I'm going to say this is, and not move from that. So I think that requires the skill of listening. And I read a great book called You're Not Listening by Kate Murphy. I'd encourage everyone to read that because I can guarantee, and I put a lot of money on this, everyone on this call today is a bad listener. I know Anthony, who speaks like me, but I know Anthony, even he could improve his listening skills. So I think that's the first point. The second, and Anthony knows because he's done work with us at one of my companies, the size of the board I think is important. My wife sits on a number of non-profits. I've sat on non-profits previously. 25 people. It's virtually impossible to manage that kind of size of board. I'm a great believer in being on a board of between 8 and 10 people. For all of us in the Northeast, I was the CEO and chair of Dunkin'. One of the reasons we were so successful was our board was small and tight, and we had about 9 people was the average during the time I was chair. The other word I use a lot is challenge. You have to challenge not only management, which everyone talks about, but challenge each other. And only 2 days ago, two of us were in a minority in a board meeting about a very important succession subject. We held our ground, we debated, and everyone came round and understood why we were saying what we thought. So I think there is a bunch of board members who sometimes take the easy way out. Being on a board isn't a sinecure. It means you have to take a few risks, and you have to take risks in the board meeting, and that requires you to challenge. The next thing, I'm not as organized, by the way, as you heard from Gail, but I got to go on about skills assessment. And this is going to be an unadulterated plug for Anthony's organization. We used him this year at Abercrombie and Fitch to look at our skills. We learned so much. We learned the gaps that we have, and indeed still have, but they came in and helped refine what we did. I mean, one of the problems I think that I learned from this process is, take someone like me who's been a CEO. You can tick all the boxes of all the skills. Anthony came in and made us focus on just 3 that we really understood. I think that was true added value for boards, and it helps you make the assessment of what skills are missing. The last thing I would add, and we may come back to this later, is I really think the board assessment for individual directors is something that all boards, again, can improve. And I'll take Abercrombie and Fitch because this is a good illustration. I think we did it really well. The chair of the governance committee actually did the feedback to the board chair. So I went round, talked to all the directors in a structured interview. And I think that's the key word, structured interview, and gave the chair the feedback. And the chair asked about all the other individuals. This year, we decided to change it up. Because we were doing the skills assessment, we went to Corn Ferry and asked them to do it. And I think, again, what I've learned from the process this year, don't do it the same way every year. Try and mix it up. And that gives each director the opportunity to have new learning points. You're not trying to fire people from the board. You're trying to make them better directors. And doing this in a different way from time to time truly does add value. I could ramble on for a lot longer, Robin, but there's a few thoughts.
No, that is great. And I look forward, I want to ask a couple of more questions and then go to chat. So I want to suggest folks out there, we have a great group. We have well over 80 folks. If you do have questions, please put them in chat. We've got a wealth of experience here to do that. Anthony, before I go back to questions to the panelists, just from your experiences optimizing boards or any stories you want to share that builds on what Gail and Nigel shared.
I would just add 2 things, because I agree completely with everything both of them said. But one is that I do think that on a lot of boards, not public necessarily, but private boards, nonprofit boards, actually the purpose of the board is less clear than you would think, and that people have different ideas, whether they're on staff or on the board, about what the board should be doing. And the role of individual directors. And I do think getting that clear is also quite important. And it sounds like pretty fundamental, but you'd be surprised how much disagreement that there is within boards and between boards and management about what the board should be doing. You sometimes see this, for instance, when somebody who is used to working with private equity boards, portfolio companies, joins a public company board, and they want to be as enthusiastic and involved with management as they would have been in the private equity board, and that's often not welcome. So getting clarity around what you want in terms of director roles and the board's role, I think, is important. And one last comment, we recently did a meeting with Ben Colton, who runs stewardship at State Street Global Advisors, and he actually reinforced that they are really sick at looking at board matrices where everyone's got 9 out of 10. And they really want to see them focused really only on the top 2 or 3 skills that each director brings. And the way I define that often is what are the topics that the other board directors will turn their heads to you because they know that kind of you're the expert at the table on that subject. And for most people, it is only 2 or 3, even though they might think it's 5 or 6.
No, that's great. That's very helpful. I think that one of the, we talked about leadership and from the top, and we also talked about kind of having a culture of openness, which I know in our prior discussions in our prep, we talked about the need for boards to have trust and the ability for people to trust one another to go through these processes. Any comments or stories about examples where there wasn't that trust or that leadership and how you had to change that, or how you maybe create that to make people open-minded, Anthony, as you said, to be evaluated, as Nigel said, to make them a better board member, not to fire them? Any thoughts on that?
I'll make a point here. One of the things that I've observed, having joined 3 very different industries, is that, trust starts with transparency. And so as I think about one of the boards I'm on, and I'll talk about Unum Group, one of the things that's very clear is that they have a board culture that they had defined, and then they review that culture together. And so what happens is when you have something that is your North Star, that new directors can come in and understand that's the North Star, can align to, then you have a place from which you can begin to ask questions and, perhaps change it if you don't see it. So I do believe that it's really important to have a North Star. And again, I think that begins, and transparency, which provides an opportunity for people to share when they see things that may not be aligned with it.
Yeah, Robin, I would say a couple of things. One is, many of the members listening may join a board that is a brand new board. Now, that's only happened to me once, which happened to be my first board when I was in England. We just turned up and started operating. So to Anthony's point, we had very different experiences. It was my first board, so I didn't even really know how a board should operate. I think you need to spend time and invest time in thinking about how the board will operate, or as Anthony said, this wasn't his words, but the mission, what the board is. And you need to review it regularly, not just once a year. As a chair, I like to say, well, how do we feel this meeting went? How could we improve it next time? And I've started a practice recently as chair of actually phoning up all the board members for like 15 minutes before the board meeting and saying, give me 2 items that we got to talk about at the next coming meeting. Because a criticism of boards is we all go, as Anthony said, we're enthusiastic. We then go away for 2 or 3 months. And then we have to think what we're going to talk about at this board meeting. I think it's a good process, I believe, to get board members thinking before the meeting, not just reading the materials, thinking about what is important to the organization.
I'd add one more thing around this trust piece, and it's just an observation. Really, a lot of boards coming out from COVID and not having met in person for a while, I think underestimated how important the social dimension of the board is in having that board gel. I mean, the fact is people just didn't know each other. They didn't know anything about each other. You had people joining boards for 2 years at least where they'd never met anybody in person. The board wasn't meeting with management. You had new members of management. So to get that trust, a social component is really important. Now, of course, it's better if it can be in person because you've got dinners, you've got lunches, you've got chatting in the corridor outside the meeting, traveling together. But if you are still doing virtual or maybe hybrid meetings, or not everybody can come to the meeting, creating some excuse to get people together one-on-one to know each other and talk to each other as people really is a great investment that will serve you well in the future when the board's under some kind of pressure.
Robin, I wanted to add, oh, go ahead. I
Go,
wanted
go.
to add to what Anthony was saying about the connections is really important, and all of my boards build that. And the other thing is ensuring, and I'm back to the leadership component, and ensuring around is that there isn't a view that there's an inside group and an outside group. And again, that comes back to the leadership of the board and the leadership of the committees to be sure that, you know, that everyone feels like they're all rowing in the same direction.
Yeah, one thing I was going to pick up on what Anthony said. I've always found that when you run a business, the strongest relationships you have within a company are the people who live furthest away, because you often travel with them, you eat with them, you drink with them, you wake up in the morning, you see them for breakfast. So the relationship is continual for a pretty intense period of time. I think boards would benefit from some of the lessons of team building and go and visit locations away together. What we all tend to do is to go to the corporate headquarters, management sits there, they sit there every day. Someone told me, a very big board in Europe, they came to America, they traveled to several locations together. Every single board member said it was the best board meeting they'd ever been to in their life. And the whole company benefited from traveling together.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Nigel. And particularly many companies are US centric maybe, but have many global operations. And I know one of the boards I was on, we planned it 2 years ahead of time, but the whole board went to Asia to go through our facilities. And we traveled, you know, not all on the same plane, but we traveled together. We worked, you know, in different hours. We visited things. We met, you know, the local people. And we really, I think everyone said the same thing. It was the best board meeting for 1,000 reasons. And then we started a practice that once a year, COVID exception taken, but once a year we tried to do another location visit like that. So I think it does go a long way. You know, I know our goal when we talked about this is really to have folks want to be excited about thinking about optimizing the board and whether they're a chair or whether they're a member. What about boards that are a little slow, maybe not as open-minded, maybe haven't caught quite the trend, and the outside catalysts that might end up becoming involved in board optimization? Maybe an activist, maybe some kind of a regulation change, maybe some type of an M&A situation. What happens when there's an outside catalyst? How is that played out if folks have had any experience with that?
Well, interesting. On one board I was on, I'd only been on the board for a year. The lead director unfortunately died. Then person who would have been the next lead director went sick, and I happened to be next in line, became lead director at the same time as we had an activist. So it was a really interesting experience. And I think the first lesson I learned is if you listen to all the advisors, we didn't engage with them fast enough, in my view. The advisors said, stand back, they'll go away, but they didn't. You should engage right from the start. So anyway, we went through the process. We brought 3 of their board members on, and the board improved a lot. I was shocked how quickly we became one group. I was shocked how quickly we didn't think of being the activists or non-activists. And the other thing that I think most people don't really get is usually the activists will go out and find board members for the situation. That does not mean that the board members truly have an activist mindset against the company. I think it's a danger for companies who believe that the activists are all difficult, nasty people. The guy who actually led this activism became a very good friend of mine, and I've worked with him subsequently. So I think it goes back to having an open mind, believing that activism is going to become more prevalent in the future, but I think it's how you start the dialogue that is the key stage.
Mhm. Yes.
And
Go ahead,
if you
Anthony.
look at- Yeah, I was just going to say, if you look at the universal proxy ballot, which is sort of going to be in operation this proxy season, you know, there's been a few examples already, and I think it is interesting that in order to make the case for why certain directors should be joining your board, they do also now make the case why certain people on your board should not be on your board. So they need to, because it's a universal ballot, they need to explain who you should not be voting for, as well as who you should be voting for. And I think that will make things a little more difficult because it's going to get personal in a way that maybe it wasn't as personal before. And so I think the boards need to be really clear themselves and really think about, well, okay, when we're doing the renomination process for our board, maybe we ought to think about how an activist would look at each of these people. And if there's someone who's been on our board 22 years or, you know, and hasn't been in management for 30 years, you know, maybe that's not the best person for our board, even though we love them dearly and, you know, they're great friends and we've known them forever. We probably need to get a little bit more tough-minded about our own board in a way that we've always been tough-minded about management and what they do and how we evaluate them.
Yeah, I would agree with both Anthony and Nigel. I mean, you know, really an activist is usually only engaged when there's some type of performance opportunity. And so I think it speaks to the need for boards to always be evaluating the strength of its board, ensuring that their board has the skills necessary to execute against the strategy. So like Nigel, I do believe that you use it. And I like what Anthony said, is looking to say, what would an activist recommend for us? And then as we're making decisions through the renomination process, ensuring that we have that on the board.
I think one thing I learned, this was a long time ago. So this is about 1997, 98. We decided as a board that a board member had to leave. Looking back, we probably didn't prepare the ground well enough because the board member was shocked, didn't understand his, it was a he, misbehavior, which was significant, but he hadn't been warned. So I think one of the benefits of the annual process, but I would indeed say you should try and make it more often. If someone is not doing what you believe is the right thing for the board, it's down to the lead director or the chair to counsel them. And I had a private situation year before last where a new, very experienced board director came on. The way he treated people in the facility was dreadful. And I talked to a few other board members and we decided that I had to talk to him right out of the gate and say, this is not the behavior we expect on this particular board. So I think it's the instant feedback that is so critical.
Yeah, I would agree. It's interesting, Nigel, that you talked about, you know, the surprise, not on one of my corporate boards, but on another board. You know, during a renomination process, someone was not, you know, selected for renomination. And the issue was, but they had no idea that there had been a problem, a major problem. And so it's so important, you know, that we're treating people with respect throughout the process, advising them how they're showing up so that there are no surprises if in fact you have a self-assessment process in place.
Yeah, and given that there's sometimes such a long lead time, you know, 10 months before the annual meeting, if there's a situation. So by having the ability to give people constructive feedback, you know, on their contribution or what's needed from them or their time commitment, et cetera, there's an opportunity for them to rise to the occasion as well. But they've also been told what's expected, right? Inspect what we expect.
Yes.
But I think, yeah, that is a challenge, and certainly nobody wants to feel surprised like that. So it is on the chairs, I think, and the leads to make sure that that communication happens.
But Robin, you not only would you not want to surprise an individual director, but the rest of the directors are looking at how that group has been treated. So it's so important that you're modeling to the entire director group how they'll be treated as well. So I do think it's just important that they see, you know, that they feel that it was handled well.
Right.
But it was interesting. On one of my boards, I had reported to me, so this particular board director never reads the material. Now, that didn't come from other directors, it came from management. And immediately, it creates a bad impression of the board in management's eyes, which is also a bad thing. It's the same point you made, Gail, but it extends even further.
Right.
And I think
Right.
one of the things that is an interesting thing to debate, and I think on one of my boards we're going to do it, you need to get feedback from management about the
Right.
board.
Right.
Which may sound, I think Anthony would agree with this. A lot of boards would find that like radical, but why not? I mean, if you're going to be open and looking for improvement,
Right.
effectively the people you work most with is the management team.
Right.
And
Right.
it's interesting, when we're doing board evaluations, we almost always interview the members of management who work most closely with the board. And even though we don't ask them to give their opinion of individual directors, because I think they find that difficult, and you might argue it's the wrong way around. If there is an issue, you're going to hear about it. And I remember sitting down with a CFO of a very large public company who absolutely berated one member of the board who continuously asked questions that indicated that he had not read the materials and had been on that board, nearly 10 years and still didn't understand fundamental things about how the business ran. And you can imagine that would infuriate management because they're constantly having to explain it all over again. So I agree. I do think talking to management is quite important. When you were all in management, you often would have 360s, right? Your subordinates would comment on you, your peers, your boss. I think that we can't exactly replicate that with boards, but you can get closer to it.
Okay. So Robin, I saw a question that came through. I don't know if you were going to get to it around, my point about we inspect what you expect.
Go ahead. Well, you can take it. And then I'm going to go to Alan too, to bring up some of the chat questions, but that's a perfect segue.
I just saw that question. And so one of the things that to me, that question really speaks to the fact that when in organizations, we inspect the financials. So we have the internal financial team and we have external auditors. We inspect our engagement survey. We typically we want to know how our employees feel. Certainly we ensure that management has a performance evaluation because we want to understand how they're performing. And Anthony just talked about certainly at most organizations, there's a 360 process because you want that feedback. And so to me, because the board is so critical to the success of the corporation, they should invest in inspecting how the directors are performing together and then how they're performing individually. So that's what I meant by that, inspecting what you expect.
No, it's a great phrase. Great. Ellen Ridgestone, Ellen's out there. Ellen, do you have anything from the chat? I see some questions coming in.
There are some great ones. Thanks, Robin. So let me give you two, and then you can decide if you want more. The first one I'll give you is, what is the skill set for the board of the future? And it says to be successful. I would take that a next step and say, when you look at the skill set today, and when you're thinking of the future, how do we think over the next, call it 5 years, the skill set of needs at a board will evolve and change, right? That's one. And two, what do you consider to be the best practices in selecting a lead director, without it becoming a political sort of event at the board level? So let me leave you with those two, and pass it back to you, Robin.
Wow, that's great. So the first question, how do we think about the skill set of the board, of the future for the next 5 years? What types of things do you think are going to become, the skills and the, culture, the nuances? So I'd love to hear folks' thought on that. We can start with that, and then we'll talk a little about that lead director.
I'll start. I do think it will be industry specific for some, but I mean, I do think technology, I mean, the reality is that that's going to always, in my mind, be critical. I think ESG is becoming more and more prominent. I think diversity, equity, and inclusion, that cultural component. I mean, we've seen the shift to having more HR people joining boards because of the cultural commitment. I think you'll see much more on the compliance. So again, I think those skills will, in addition to your P&L skills, but I think those skills will be pretty critical going forward.
So I agree with that list. I mean, obviously right at the heart of it is technology. And a favorite phrase of mine is, today is the slowest day that you will see, because the world's going to continue to speed up. So I think all directors have to have a way of connecting with the future. I'm very fortunate. I have at home a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old. So that is a fantastic way of connecting. But I think board directors need to read more so that they can be informed. Read and listen. I think one of the greatest assets is podcasts. I mean, however you listen to them in the car or working out or whatever, there's some great podcasts out there that look to the future. As one, I could look it up, it's called the Digital something or other. But I think boards need to, when they are evaluating the strategy, not just rely on what management's saying, they need to have their own thoughts.
Right.
So that means you have to read, you have to listen. I set myself a goal of actually reading 7 newspapers, not fully, looking at them each day from around the world. I mean, read papers from other countries, particularly if it's a global company. So it's more of a forward-looking approach.
Yeah. Go ahead, Anthony.
Yeah, sorry, I would add, look, it's got to start with the strategy. So if you know that the company is going to be evolving in a certain direction over a period of time, having directors who are going to have the right skills for the company you will be in the next 3 years or so is quite important, because oftentimes we've got directors with the skill sets for the company we were 10 years ago, and we haven't refreshed enough over time. So that's my first point, is understand the strategy and where it's going. So to think about it, I think I agree with everything we've heard about technology, and it's going to be as much about AI and robotics and machine learning as a component of that. I do think we've seen a little bit of a trend back towards thinking about more international skill sets on the board. During COVID, there was a reluctance to put anybody overseas on boards because, people were thinking, well, how's that all going to work? Although, of course, you could do it quite well with a Zoom. But I think there's more interest in that now as we're emerging from the pandemic, and given all the geopolitical issues that are out there and the supply chain issues and so on. But really, I think the key thing, and it builds on something that Nigel was just saying, is the ability to learn and relearn, because coming into the board with the knowledge that you have today is not going to cut it if you're still on that board in 5 or 10 years' time. You will need a different set of knowledge. It'll be a different world and a different company. And so unless you have an appetite for learning, a curiosity, are willing to get out and go to the industry conferences, to listen to the other companies' earnings results, not just your own, unless you're willing to kind of immerse yourself in that way, you're rapidly going to become out of date. And if there is an increased scrutiny on who's really adding value to the board, you're putting yourself in the crosshairs.
Yeah, I think tying back to, we're talking about the skills matrices and what are the 3 most predominant skills, so everybody doesn't have 9 out of the 10 skills. And I think the flip side is, in some of the experiences I've had, is that doesn't mean that the rest of the board doesn't have to have some table stakes and baseline across the board. And so to Nigel's point about learning, you can't just depend on somebody coming in that knows AI or ChatGPT or knows cybersecurity and have no idea, right? Because there's still a whole dynamic of how does it apply to your firm? What's the strategy? What skills do we need? You know, there's investments required. There's all kinds of business elements. But I do think, I love the thought that everybody, I think, going forward on the futures of the board are going to have more heavy lifting or thinking lifting outside of their expertise areas, and that they are going to have to take time and invest time, or boards can do, you know, education, you know, and bring speakers in just for the board to kind of get these other views, because there's a lot of complexity out there. And I think everybody's got to raise their game a bit to understand, you know, some of these trends and technology and global and the world, et cetera, as well. Great. So how about the lead director question? What do we think the kind of best practices are thinking about choosing a lead director, being a lead director? We've touched upon a little bit, saying leadership's where it starts and ends. So maybe just fleshing that out a little more on your experiences or thoughts.
I think the first thing I'd say is it's a tough role. I've been a lead director twice. You heard one of the examples when I had the activists. And I think the reason it's a tough role actually came out in the discussion we had at one board this week when we were looking at a shareholder proposal. And it's really, a lot of people believe the lead director is a diluted chairperson. Is that true or not? And I think it's a fascinating question. People believe that the lead director has zero authority over the CEO, whereas the chairperson does. So I think you need to start there. The board needs to decide what is the role of the lead director. And I think you need to have some pretty unique skills. How do you take the view of the board, communicate what happened in the executive session to the CEO in a motivating, not dispiriting way? Because I think a lot of stuff gets talked about in executive sessions, which sometimes goes way offline. And I remember as a CEO, I had a lead director I really appreciated. He said there was a lot of discussion about this. The take you need to know is you need to focus on this thing. In other words, he filleted the debate and got to the key point that would help me as a CEO. So I think it's a difficult role. So I think back to the question about the skills, facilitating skills, listening skills, which is a big thing of mine, as you probably gathered. And I think you need to have the credibility that the rest of the board can have confidence that you will take the messages and deliver them properly.
I would agree with everything Nigel has said. I would say that like when you're in your jobs in corporate, is that you've got to show up well in the role that you're in. So, you know, if what you're doing is you have aspirations to become the lead director, then you've got to really show up well. You've got to show up as a leader and being prepared and doing the work as a director, being supportive of the leadership, you know, because we're looking at everything you're doing at that point in time. I do think having great leadership skills. I do think being viewed as someone who is a partner who communicates well and is transparent. I think all of the things that we do in the roles that we're currently in helps us move to the next level. And I think it's just really important.
I'll just add one component because I agree with everything that I heard, which is that we shouldn't underestimate the external component, because it is often the lead director that shareholders want to meet with if they want to discuss something with the board or to understand the board's position. And if it's not a compensation issue, that normally falls to the lead director. So having someone who is no stranger to communicating with investors, has probably had some training to do that, may have done it in their day job, I think is an important consideration. But going back to what we said right at the beginning of this conversation, I think you want to look to find someone who can give and receive feedback, because we've all said how important it is, and clearly you're doing it on your boards. But the fact is, I go into an awful lot of boards where there is no feedback at all. The first feedback those directors have ever had comes from us, and that's not right. It should be a continuous process, as Nigel said, and as Gail said. And so picking someone to be the chair or the lead director who is willing to give and receive feedback on a continuous basis throughout the year, I think that's got to be a very important component.
Yeah, and I think, go ahead, Nigel.
Sorry, Anthony said something which I've never heard him say, but made me think. This whole business of dealing with external shareholders, investors, call them what you like. I don't know if there's any data that Anthony has, but I would suspect only about 20% of board directors have ever truly had to deal with investor relations. And they don't quite understand how it all works. And Anthony, I don't know, do you have any data on that? Because I think it's an important skill in the lead director position, as you said.
Well, oftentimes you'll find that lead director roles tend to go to former CEOs or former CFOs for exactly that reason. And of course, they are people who've got very good, typically very good investor relations skills. But people can be trained to do it. I have known wonderful lead directors over the years who did not come from that background. And I think part of the problem is if you do make that the be all and end all, you end up with all the lead directors looking a bit like each other, because the CEOs and CFOs tends to skew to certain demographics, and you end up with a sort of almost a glass ceiling in the board that women or other people cannot become the lead director or the chair because they haven't had that experience before. I do think you could get trained in it, but you've got to have someone who is going to be, maybe they've done other things that involves very sensitive communication issues, just not to that audience, but thinking broadly about adjacent skill sets, so you don't just end up with the same people over and over again in those roles.
Robin, apologize for jumping in. The question was not only about skill sets, but was also about the selection process.
Right.
So you might want to touch a little bit on that. I'm sorry for jumping in.
No, that's excellent. I saw that, and that's great. I appreciate that. Yeah, so Anthony, Nigel, Gail, the selection process, if you have a board, either there has not been a lead director role, I've been on a board that there was not one, and then they created the role for different reasons, or it's going to be going to a new person, et cetera. How does the selection process work? Internally, externally, et cetera? Any thoughts on that?
I'll just make this point, and then I'm sure Anthony and Nigel, but I think it begins very much like we're selecting a CEO. I mean, you've got to begin with an understanding of exactly what skills are you looking for in the lead director. And that begins with getting different feedback from the CEO and key stakeholders to within the organization. It's sort of putting together a profile of what the lead director is, and then moving from there to having an agreement on that. And then, of course, then you can begin to look at your current directors and even external directors as you're bringing in, because it's not a one-year process. It should be a 3 to 5 year process that you're saying when you're even bringing on new directors, you're saying, we know that our lead director needs to have this particular skills, these particular skills. So again, I believe it begins with identification and then moving from there, and then development. And Anthony, you're nodding. Nigel, I don't know if you have anything to add or a different perspective there.
Yeah, perhaps I have a slightly different perspective based on my experience. I think sometimes lead directors are who will do it. And that's perhaps a cynical approach, but if I take you through the 2 times I became lead director, there was a natural guy on one board who should have been the lead director. I've never seen this before. He went back to his boss and he was told he couldn't do it because he thought, this is the boss, thought the job was too high profile and he didn't want his company getting impacted by this individual being the lead director. So I kind of fell into the role. And then the other time I told you about earlier is about how someone died and someone was sick. So I'm not sure as much thought goes into it as all of us would like. Anthony may disprove me, not for the first time, but I really think this is a very thoughtful question that I think I'm learning while I'm sitting here thinking about how I could have done better in other places. Anthony?
You know, it's funny. I think Woody Allen said that 90% of success in life is showing up. And you might amend that to say, or being able to show up. So availability is, I think, quite an important point to consider when you are looking at a lead director. Do they actually have the time to do the job? If they're on multiple boards and, you know, other things that they're involved in, maybe they're not going to have the time either. So I do think that needs to be taken into account. But I agree with Gail that just starting with, you know, what do we want this person to do? I always think a great question to ask is, how do you want the role to be done differently from the person who's doing it today? And that's not to, you know, take anything away from the way it's being done today, but things have changed and maybe you need more external focus than you did before. Maybe it's the internal focus that's not there. So just getting some clarity around what you're looking for. And I also agree with Gail that thinking about this early on, the nominating governance committee should be thinking about this when they're recruiting people to the board for the future, people who would have many of the skills that you'd be looking for, but also being very deliberate about how you place people in committee chair roles so that they have an opportunity to show what they can do in terms of leading a meeting and doing the facilitation and prepping with management and so on before they get to the role. We did some research on this a few years ago, and it basically showed that most of people who become a lead director have actually been a committee chair, either at that company or on another board that they're on prior to becoming the lead director. And so, you know, thinking about it as actually a succession process and not just a one-off election or selection when somebody dies or something happens. And to that end, by the way, we ought to be also thinking about what would we do if the proverbial bus came around the corner and we lost our lead director. Lead directors play a very important role in the board and with management, and you ought to have an idea about, well, who could step in if we needed that, because otherwise, you know, it's going to make it a lot harder in the event that something does happen.
Yeah, and I think that we're talking about board optimization and effectiveness, et cetera, and a little bit theoretically, right? And that in fact, that if you do have something happen externally, or you have, and sounds Nigel, I've had people pass away on boards, et cetera. If you don't have kind of a succession plan at the board level where you know who's on deck for audit, you know who might be on deck for nom and gov, someone's been on deck at HR&C, and you've been giving them more responsibilities so they can rise to chair, you can end up on your back foot a bit on that, because the chairs maybe have been so strong and so good that the rest of the committee lets them run it. And so I love that idea of sharing and spreading the chair assignments around, you know, making people get different exposures and seeing how they perform when they're asked to do that role. One of the questions I just saw come up in the chat, although Ellen, I'm trusting you on the bigger chat, I just happened to see one of the last questions, was we're talking about, isn't it great? We want to optimize the board. We want it to be more effective. We want to think about strategy. We want to think about our needs going forward. What are your folks' thoughts about, again, maybe some boards that hadn't moved as quickly or from a different, you know, era, et cetera, in terms of term limits and age limits? Have you had experiences, you know, positive or otherwise or not, thoughts on that? Is it a trend anymore? Has it gone away?
So I was the governance chair on 2 public boards a few months ago. One, we got rid of the age requirement, and the other we didn't. And I think the big argument in favor of getting rid of the age limits is we've got presidents, rightly or wrongly, who are in their 80s. So is 72 or whatever the age limit relevant these days when people tend to be fitter than they were many years ago? So I think that's something you have to take into consideration, but you shouldn't rest on your laurels. And the one that we removed the age requirement, the mandatory retirement age, we actually brought Anthony in to help us with our process to make sure that our review of directors was done in a sensitive but robust way. I think term limits is a very American concept. I don't think there's an awful lot of term limits I see in the UK. I personally believe if a director is contributing, and it gets back to the same point, if there's contributions that these people are making, why term them off? My wife just termed off as chair of a very important charity. Within 6 months, they've asked her to go back on the board. So I think that shows the fallacy of the process. I think it gets back and joining all these dots. If you have a robust board evaluation process, why have any limits?
Yeah. So I would agree with him. I think you have to be careful with age limits because you lose good people. But it really does get back to the strength of the board, the leadership. I mean, the reality is that, you know, in today's environment, you can't have a board with everyone being a certain age. It's the diversity of your board. So as long as the board is looking at the diversity of the board, it shouldn't care. So if you have more experience age-wise, it shouldn't matter. But you can't have just like you can't have an all majority board, you need to just have great diversity on your board. So I don't think the age matter if you're looking at it through a holistic filter.
Well, I think actually it's interesting you say about that. One of the big criticisms I make of boards is that we don't have enough young people. I mean,
Right.
people who are closer to the consumer. And I was on another board a few years ago. We bought a company and the CEO of the company was 38. He joined the board. My God, did he revolutionize how board practices? I mean, he was a catalyst for a lot of positive change.
Right.
Great. Ellen, any other questions out there in the chat from our great group?
So I think one question that's been sitting out there for a while is, have any of you ever utilized advisory boards as a supplement to tap into skill sets that may be needed periodically, but may not justify bringing someone on as a full-time board member, especially as most boards are trying to get smaller, right? Certainly you don't want to have larger boards. And so you're trying to be smaller, and therefore, what about advisory, some sort of an advisory board or advisor to the board? To fill
I've not
specific
seen it
skills?
as on my corporate boards, but I have seen advisors on my not-for-profit boards.
This might be a good day to talk about this because being the chairman of a football club in England, the government announced a white paper today. And one of the proposals is that fans should have advisory boards to football clubs. So we actually have kind of an advisory board at our club. It's very helpful. We learn a lot. I think you have to be very careful how much authority they have, but it gives you good insight as long as you don't give them too much authority for things that is really the authority of the main board.
I think one observation I'd have, so a lot of companies have advisory boards, but they are advisory boards to management.
Right.
Yes,
And there's really no connection between the advisory board and the board. They don't meet together. They don't necessarily talk together. And I think that's a lost opportunity, because we were talking about the need for continuous education and knowing a lot of things, not just your own topic areas. And actually being able to interact with advisory boards, it could be one way of doing that, of sort of really refreshing your knowledge. We see a lot of advisory boards, for instance, in the life sciences sector, because they understand the science and the technology in a way that oftentimes not all the board do. But if the board can tap into that themselves and go watch the advisory board in action, or have a joint meeting, I think there's definitely value to be had.
Yeah, Anthony, I think that's an excellent point. And I think a lot of it comes down to being open, being a learner, looking for boards looking to grow their own knowledge base. And, in the life sciences companies, you often see, you're right, the scientific advisory board, predominantly with management, but I have had boards say, hey, we'd love to do a series, where over the course of, once a quarter, we have an advisor or an expert on such and such a topic, do a 90-minute session with us. And that was great, because during COVID, it really allowed people that were everywhere on a Tuesday to connect, with somebody that had a specific expertise that maybe the board wasn't being exposed to. So I think, again, whether it's the chair or whether it's the CEO that suggests it, anything that offers the board, kind of a broader view of knowledge of something that they might not be exposed to could be really valuable and prompt different questions and different dialogue.
It's interesting, having run franchise companies predominantly, boards have really interesting mixes of views about the franchise advisory bodies. I mean, let's face it, if you take Dunkin', that's 100% franchise, and we sold it at the end of 20, so it doesn't exist as an entity anymore. It does as a brand, of course, but the board were very nervous about talking to the franchise advisory board because it's seen as a union. Now, would you talk to a union as a board? Possibly not, though Starbucks may have views on that. But I really think you have to sometimes debate, should you be going out and talking to a group which in the franchise world is effectively your customers? I mean, they pay fees to the company. And I think standing back from it and listening to this conversation, I think there's some kind of role that you need to do. And on one of my private boards, we do talk to the franchisees.
Mm-hmm. Great. So Ellen, we're keeping this panel busy here. What else do we have out there? Is there anything we missed? And then we're going to do a kind of circle back with everybody at the end, I think, a little bit, but.
Well, so one of the questions that was a follow-up had to do again with the advisory boards, as a question as to whether this could be theoretically a bench for future board members. And has anyone ever tried that? But so that might be something to think about.
I have not seen that, but that's just my personal experience, but I haven't been exposed to that kind of.
It can happen, it does happen, but I think oftentimes people are selected for advisory boards for different reason, that they have a sort of a very deep but very narrow expertise on something that you absolutely want to tap into, but doesn't necessarily lend itself to the broader role that board directors have to play. I mean, and that was the problem a few years ago when a lot of cybersecurity experts were put on boards, but it was soon discovered that, for instance, when it came to a discussion about CEO succession planning or broader strategic issues, two of the key things the board has to do, they didn't really have anything to say because they had no direct experience of any of that. So I think you have to be careful that the board doesn't become over specialized.
I think the question is a really interesting one, but one of the things I think you should do when you interview directors is ask them about their board experience, because I view board experience as being on any board. I mean, it could be a church board, if there's such a thing. It could be a hospital board. You need to understand how they perceive their position on a board. So I think it's great experience. I haven't seen the advisory board idea, but I think how you interview potential board members should take that into account.
Yeah, have they had experiences, maybe not on a public board, but the difference between governing and managing, so they understand that, you know, what you do as governing and guiding is much different. And that was back to your earlier point, Anthony, on private equity boards, where they might be smaller boards, they're more focused, it's a particular culture and cadence. And then when either they become public or the private equity folks, you know, somebody that's been on a private board moves to a public board, it's a different, potentially different process or cadence. Great. All right, Ellen, I'm gonna ask the board a tough question. If you don't have anything else out there, anything else?
I think back to you, Robin.
Okay, so I'm gonna, before we do our final takeaways at the end and what we want folks to walk away with their marching orders or your insights, what is the hardest thing that you had to deal with either during the board evaluation process or refreshment process? So the really kind of a challenging, hard situation. I'll start. I've been on a board where we had a very wonderful board person that had been on for a long time. And there was definitely, because potentially the company was changing and doing different things, that the board refreshment process was in full tilt. And some of the board members over time volunteered or could see that it was potentially a good time to move on and to allow the board to be effective and improve the position, but not everyone saw it that way. And so I think that the hard thing is to be able to focus on what's important to the company and the performance and what's the needs are, but be also very sensitive to how do you communicate and navigate that? How much time does one allow for that? Understanding, even though it's not personal, but being able to really be collaborative, collegial, and make it all as constructive as possible. And it's not, people are people at the end of the day. So I think sometimes, again, on paper and theoretic, it sounds great to refresh a board, but sometimes it's not always as easy.
Go ahead, Nigel, I'm sorry.
I think it's a really interesting question. One of the things I challenge with, at the end of the day, whether we like it or not, you're actually asking someone to leave the organization, and they will view it as termination. Right. So what tends to happen is you have a conversation with them, and then you go into the process of setting up the slate for the annual meeting. There's a lot of time, and they will often go to 1 or 2 board meetings before they leave the board. That can impact their behavior, and any impression of them gets worse. Now, I've got no solution to the problem, but I think it's difficult when you tell someone that, well, for whatever reason, we've decided we don't want to renominate you, but they're around for another couple of meetings. That needs a lot of very sensitive handling.
I would agree. I think, Robin, you said it best. You know, what I observed is when someone was surprised at the fact that they had not been renominated. And so again, I think that, as long as we remember that we're dealing with people and, they may not like the outcome as long as they know that they were treated fairly throughout the process. I think it's really critical.
My only observation is that all the ones we get involved with are the hardest one, and that's why I've got no hair left. And what I have got left is grey. And a lot of the time it is about individuals and how they behave and whether they'll listen to the feedback that they are given and how they will do that. But the strangest one I ever did was in a European nation where we were doing a company that had got itself into a lot of bother with a scandal, and the CEO and the chair had fallen out rather publicly. And there was intense media interest in the company to the point that it was front page news for days and days and days. And it was leaked that we were doing the board evaluation. And on the day that we were due to present to the board the findings of the evaluation, we had to be brought in the back fire escape entrance to the building, taken up on a rampart across the top of their lobby. And as we looked down, we could see the media and the television cameras waiting for us to come in the front door. And we were sneaking across the top of the lobby on this sort of catwalk thing in order to get into the boardroom. So that was definitely the weirdest one I ever did. Actually, the board was fine. They wanted the feedback and they implemented all the recommendations, but it was doing that in the intense glare of media interest, which I can tell you is pretty rare in the world of board evaluation.
Right. Well, this has been fabulous, and I'm going to do the final lightning round. I came in with pretty high expectations because I know how incredibly experienced and talented and open the three of you are, and have enjoyed getting to know you better. But this was just really enjoyable for me, and again, honored to be part of this. And we want folks to leave and thinking about improving their boards and how do they change behaviors, or how do they go back and help contribute. So what would your one or two either sentences or takeaways or a parting thought for our gang here?
I'll start. I hope that that you walk away with an appreciation for the value of self-assessment and continuous learning for you as individuals, and support of driving shareholder value. And then the last thing I'll talk about is really getting back to leadership matters, and that if you see opportunity on your boards, that hopefully you are supporting the leadership structure that's in place now, but also preparing yourself to perhaps be in a position to ensure that the things that you think are important, are implemented within that organization. So again, it's been a pleasure being on this panel with Anthony and Nigel, and Robin. Thank you for being such a great facilitator.
So this has been really fascinating learning. As I've said a couple of times, I've learned from the discussion. I think my takeaway is a board is an organization, not a thing. All organizations need help, need feeding, supporting, and all the disciplines that you might have in an organization of reviews, training, development, apply to boards. Many companies don't think of boards like that. And I think what sums it up is when we talk about strategy, we all have to, and I think Anthony said it well, we all need to keep learning, because what was required 2 or 3 years ago is going to be different in the future. So a learning organization probably sums it up well.
I think my takeaway, based on everything that I heard in the conversation, is that directors are going to have to do fewer boards better. So they're going to spend more hours outside the boardroom, learning, giving and receiving feedback, all the things we've talked about, which means necessarily that you'll do fewer of them. Hopefully you'll get paid better for the ones that you're on because of the number of hours you're putting in. But I do think that's the future. I mean, the days when you could do 5 public company boards, which I know is sort of what a lot of the proxy advisors will allow you to do, it's, you know, if you're going to do it properly and you're on some private boards and you're on your alma mater board and all these other things, that's a lot of work. And so, you know, considering which are the ones you really want to do and then investing the time to do them really well.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm going to hand it. Thank you again so much. It's just been fabulous. I'm going to hand it back to Beth, I believe, Beth Boland now to wrap us up.
Thanks so much. This was truly fantastic conversation, and it really illustrates the role of wisdom and experience in being able to pull together the elements that are needed for an effective board. It's about human beings and human interaction, and our panelists had a wealth of experience in all of that. So we thank you very much. So for everybody who is still with us, I want to announce a couple of our upcoming programs, all equally fascinating. The next one is on March 9th. We have a virtual event that is part of our private company series, but it's a topic that will apply to anyone on any type of board. It's a two-part digital transformation series, and this is session 1, and it will focus on the Internet of Things, a very hot topic now. On March 30th, we will host virtually the Future of the American Board with the Minnesota chapter. As everyone may recall, the Blue Ribbon Commission report of NACD is on the Future of the American Board, and we have an all-star cast of panelists for that as well. I also want to highlight 2 upcoming all-day programs that we have. The first is for aspiring public company directors, and that is for April 20th. It's going to be in person here in Boston at the KPMG's office. And on June 15th is a special all-day session that we do every year, at least all years other than in COVID, where it's for experienced public company directors. We limit that to only 20 to 25 folks so that it's highly interactive. And so if you or anyone you know is interested in that all-day in-person program, please sign up now because spots are limited for that. Don't forget to do your survey. You will be getting a survey by email. Please fill that out. We do listen to you and all of your comments. And with that, we thank everybody for being here. And we thank in particular our panelists who put on such a terrific program. Thank you again.